Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see you here today. Welcome to our April 360 presentation. I am Curator of Education, Anna Smith, and today it's my pleasure to introduce artist Jonathan Hammer. So, we've had the pleasure of spending several days with Jonathan Hammer here at the Nasher, and one thing I can promise you all today is that if you love art, apocrypha, and a good story, you are in for a treat. Hammer trained at the London College of Bookbinding and developed a skill set that has led him down a fascinating artistic path that traverses the realms of sculpture, painting, photography, and literature. We're fortunate to have a work on hand today that should give you just a taste of Hammer's oeuvre. I'll let him tell you about it, but I will tease you with the fact that the image you see is made up entirely of animal skins using a painstaking leather marquetry technique. Like the work you see in front of you, Hammer's art is rich in symbolism and often expresses complex dualities, juxtaposing victim and victimizer, power and powerlessness, innocence and malevolence. Jonathan Hammer has been the subject of solo exhibitions worldwide, in cities including Los Angeles, New York, Paris, Madrid, Barcelona, Mexico City, Geneva, Zurich, and Berlin, just to name a few. His work is held in the public collections of such internationally renowned institutions as the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Hammer Museum, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the New York Public Library. In 2002, Hammer published a new illustrated translation of Hugo Ball's visionary novella, Tinderenda the Fantast, along with his own critical writing on Dadaism in Ball and Hammer. I'm eager to cut to the chase today because I know that our guest has some fascinating stories to share with us, so please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jonathan Hammer.
Okay, I want to thank all of you here in Dallas, the Nasher specifically. It's a wonderful town. It's the first time that I've been here, and I love it and hope to come back. And I also want to thank Jeremy Strix, the director of the Nasher. You're lucky to have this beautiful place and that it's part of this wonderful art community. What I'm going to try to do today is a little different than a normal artist's talk. It's not going to follow the rules of, for the last 28 years, this is what I've been doing, starting with this, moving to that, moving to that. I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity to bookend a kind of narrative, a kind of story, partly because of today's date. Today is April 11th, and there is something that happened to me April 9th, 2005. So this is exactly a 10-year bookend, and I thought it would be an opportunity to structure the talk in a slightly different way, and in a way show you, at least in the case of this artist, that sometimes things that happen in our lives or happen in our careers actually do change how we make art and what we make. Some of the things I'm going to show you over the last 10 years, I had no idea that I would be led down this path 12 years ago or before that. And I think it's very important because people wonder, how does an artist decide what to do, and what do you do when you're in the studio, and how do things that happen to you in your life influence what the oeuvre is, as Anna calls it, the body of work. I'll start with this piece. Now, I brought that leather piece because much of what you're going to see is made from exotic skin, and the slides don't show that so well, but afterwards we can look at a piece there, and you can see that everything you're seeing is a skin, whether it's frog or shark or stingray, any number of things. But that's just to formally tell you what's going on with the materials. I was teaching at the art school in Bergen, Norway for a number of years. I live in Barcelona and would pop up to Bergen for about 1 week every 6 weeks. For, I don't know, about 5 years I was doing that, doing critiques with graduate students at the art school. And there's one gallery in Bergen that's sort of an international gallery, and somewhere during my time teaching up there, I was invited to do an exhibition at this gallery. And I decided to put together a series of leather panels, some of which I had made before. We sort of got a lot of older material together to Norway because a little bit off the beaten track. The show was April 9th, 2005, was the opening. And strangely enough, and I should have known this was prescient, but who can know something is prescient beforehand, the gallerist said to me, oh, you know, April 9th is when the Germans marched into Norway and occupied it. And I thought, why are you telling me this? This is like the strangest thing to tell me. And I was thinking about it and thinking, okay, this is April 9th. What am I going to title this show? And I picked I Loved You Once in April as a kind of riff on the idea of the Nazis entering and occupying Norway. It's actually from an old standard, but that's just to give you an idea of how this story that I'm going to tell you works, because I do work quite a bit with narrative and storytelling in a way. What I was showing in this exhibition in Norway were these leather panels. This one comes from a series where I was influenced by voodoo banners from Haiti. I don't know if any of you have seen those sequined voodoo banners. For me, some of this work was made in the late 90s, and I was particularly interested in investigating things around the AIDS epidemic. I lived in San Francisco from '82 to 2002 and was quite involved, and as were many artists and many peers in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, of course other cities as well. People know about work that was made often because there was a Whitney Biennial. I think it was in 92, was it, Jeremy? 92 or 94 was particularly well known because a lot of artists were working around vocabulary that involved the AIDS epidemic. However, a great deal of that work was what I would call agitprop. It was direct activist work. And I was particularly more interested in a conceptual idea of what was going on around me. Not necessarily to draw any direct comparison, but with the show upstairs of Melvin Edwards, you know, you see that he is bringing up lots of issues that are political, race-oriented, all kinds of things, but doing it in a very subtle internal way, not in a kind of agitprop way. And I think that that's something that I was trying to do. I was interested in this stuff because of zombies, because for me, surrounded by people who were sick with AIDS, I saw this transition from the tipping over from the living being into your body becomes almost more death-like. You're 51% disease, and what does that look like? And I was particularly interested in this idea, and that's where these are coming from. So this is part of a series that are a little bigger than that piece that you see over there. And then from there, I moved into, this is another one, Baron Samdi's grave. So these are traditional voodoo ideas, and in the voodoo religion, you'll hear something called zombie, king, and clown, because this figure of the zombie that we love watching on television so much, in a way, is both a king and a clown. He's a kind of the all-powerful zombie, as well as the clown, yeah? I mean, the one who goes, I'm gonna get you. So I was very interested in this in relationship to disease. I'm also, at this show in Norway, was working with the idea of sacred foods and agriculture. Now everybody in this room has heard of the paleo diet and all of this stuff. I was interested in this quite a long time ago about how the idea that agriculture is something that actually brought disease and vulnerability to the human organism. And again, these were investigations into disease. So these are all made out of leather. Again, this one is onion, this one is lemon. And you see, well, I won't go into right now individual works, but you can see what's going on. This one actually is at MoCA in Los Angeles. Corn that the Berkeley Museum has. So it's a reinvestigation of how we changed in terms of agriculture and how that relates to disease. You might ask why skin, and I'll keep bringing this back into the story, but skin for me is sort of the original paper. It's the original thing that you write on, that you tear up and make your mark on. It's also the thing that we use to differentiate what we are from the other. We like to think that skin is what makes us embrace each other, but in fact, it's to the contrary. Skin is what makes me know I'm not this table. It's the organ of the sense of touch. And for me, this is very interesting in terms of artwork about the body and the skin that we wear and the body that we write on, if you will. So again, this is still related to issues of disease, but in a subtle way, as I saw it kind of as an evolutionary process of disease. This is olive. This one, which you saw before, this is a two-part where this is an eyeball, and the title is My Mother Told Me That the Doctor Said the Eyeball is a Window to the Soul. And it follows this kind of medical interpretation of the eye as the body. So you can see various parts of the body. That's the left one and the right one. Yeah, just to give you an idea of how those work together. Then something happened to me at this opening in Bergen, Norway. There were a couple of curators there who told me that they worked for the Lithuanian National Gallery in Kaunas, Lithuania, and they really liked this work a lot, and they said, we would like to organize a show of your work at the Lithuanian National Gallery, which I'm showing you here in a bad slide because I got it off the internet. But I said, where? They said, it's in this city called Kaunas, and Kaunas is the interim capital between the wars of Lithuania. And we began to organize a show, and the show we decided on was going to be of my photographic work, which I'll get to. And I was meant to have that full round space. And this is only a portion of a very, very large building complex from the Art Deco period. It's very much like the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. This is a place that has, like, I don't know, 150 people who pretend to work and they pretend to pay them. They have no money at all. Yeah, and they were desperate to get a show because something from the Czech Republic had been canceled. And we had this big dinner in Norway at the opening for the Norwegian show, and toasts and bawdy songs were sung as they do in those countries. And we began to organize this exhibition. What was to be in the exhibition were a series of photographs, which I'll get to. I had been making a body of works on paper, of drawings, for many years, and after I had several hundred of these images, I began to feel as if they didn't really need to be living on paper on a wall. I began to see them in environments, and I began searching around the world to see where I thought my guys would live. I don't know, maybe this work is a little dated. It's from the late 90s, and I was, I guess, one of the first people working with gaming programmers in Silicon Valley to three-dimensionalize my drawings. So what these photographs are actually drawings that were then extrapolated into skeletons three-dimensionally and then placed inside analog photographs that I would take. And it turns out that I began to see my guys in a sort of equatorial region. So I went to West Africa and took a lot of photographs. I went to the north of Brazil and took a lot of photographs. And these are various places where I then would put the drawing extrapolated into a photograph and then rephotograph it, essentially. And it was a way of getting these works on paper into a more living sculptural place. This gives you an example of the transition from a drawing to the three-dimensionalization of the drawing. Yeah. Meanwhile, while I'm setting up this show, they had said, we don't have any money. What can you do to help us bring this show to Lithuania, and I thought, well, okay. I asked my gallery in New York, Matthew Marks, to frame everything. There's a French writer, Marie Dariussec, who agreed to write an original text for a catalog. The Norwegian collector agreed to truck everything to Lithuania. I got a whole team together, about 5 countries. And then just as an aside, does anyone recognize what that kind of imaginary city in the background might be? It's a cemetery in Brazil. Yeah. So this is how, just to give you an idea of how I began placing my images and my guys, I would see them in places that didn't really exist, but they were in fact functioning as alter beings in an alter universe. So I began thinking about this Lithuanian exhibition in this museum, and I was involving a lot of people. And I kept thinking, Kaunas, what is this city Kaunas? And why does it sound sort of familiar? And then I realized that Kaunas is the same as Kovno. In German and Lithuanian, the city is called Kaunas. In Russian and Yiddish, it's called Kovno. My grandparents are from Kovno. They were born in the 19th century. I never knew them because I'm the youngest of the youngest of the youngest. But this, in fact, is where I'm from. And I went back to the curators, and now the story is going to get a little bit heavy, so I want to warn you all that there are going to be some dark things that I talk about, but I will break the talk up with some levity in the middle. When I told the curators that, in fact, I was from this town where this museum was, and was, in fact, in a way, a third-generation Lithuanian artist, the exhibition was erased from memory. There was no longer any contact with the museum. The curators were no longer picking up their cell phones. No one would talk to me. I already had a team of people from France, Norway, Spain, the United States involved in getting this show together. And I really will never know why. I suspect why, and I began to investigate what the history of Kovno was, and in fact, it's a very dark history. It's a very dark history in the war. While, as you can see, none of this work has any implication of my own ethnic background or religious background, I suspect that the show was erased because of what had happened in World War II. Let's finish up with these photographs, and then I'll show you what I made. So here's another example. This is a good one, because here you can see the actual drawing, which is in the collection of MoMA in New York, and how that was transformed with early primitive gaming programs and then set inside a landscape. And the drawing actually becomes a sculpture. It's titled Overwrought Whirligig. Now, what I learned as I started to do research was that the city of Kovno was 50% Jewish and 50% combination Russian-Lithuanian before the war. When the Nazis entered, and this is the hard part, I warn you, entered the city in 1941, last aside on this section, this was written about by Marie Dariussec to be she wrote a story about this to be in the catalog, and we later published this in a magazine called Du, which is the Swiss magazine of culture, because we didn't have a catalog for this show, as it turns out. There was no show. And these are also further large drawings. I think this one is at the Whitney, that harken back to this idea of toy, monster, violence, and how disease overtakes the body, what you look like when you're 51% ill. And this was a large series of gouaches about 7 feet tall. And there you see, again, the three-dimensionalization of the drawing placed into a very strange landscape. This landscape, in fact, was a palace that was built in Brazil, in the north of Brazil, because the inhabitants of this town were told that Pedro II, the emperor, was going to visit them, and they built him a palace, and guess what? He never came. And this was a town where people were sending their laundry back to Lisbon. This is the level of decadence. And so for me, this was a culture based very much on extremes of master-slave, violence, benevolence, illness, disease, and health, etc. And this is, in fact, that town where they built the palace with my guys around. I'm truncating the story here by showing you a lot of work at the same time. These were drawings that were made during this same period, large drawings. These are in the Hammer Museum, of strange architecture that had no purpose that I found in West Africa. Again, that my characters I saw living there. No one knows what this building is for. It's a building that I drew from a building in a place called Grand Bassam in the Ivory Coast, where the French were the colonizers, and every last one of them died of malaria in 12 years because they refused to change their standards. They dressed up, parasols, the whole thing wiped out. And this is a building that nobody knows what it's for. And these were a series of drawings around this voodoo, around this disease, around my characters and where they fit in. And those two go together. And like I said, there at the Hammer, if you see, there's a character in the balcony, a kind of a rag doll, an angel, and a head. And here they're forced to become one character. Part of this is a psychological issue because we talk about the house as being the psychology of the person. And I decided that this was the house of the personality, and these were the inhabitants, and this is the character. Okay, so what happened when the Germans came in 1941 is the Lithuanians went mad with violence, and they rounded up a number of Jews into a garage, about 2,000 or 3,000, I think, and they were bludgeoned. And there was a decapitation of the rabbi. And the Lithuanians went on top of piles of bodies and played the Lithuanian national anthem on the accordion. Sorry to be so heavy, but we know this because the Germans filmed it. And this film can be seen. It's a 3-minute film. So when this exhibition was erased, and then strangely it had begun on April 9th, I thought, I have to begin to make art about this, because I didn't know where to place these emotional feelings, this resonance, but I thought, okay, I'm an artist. Let's do the job. Let's make what I need to make. And I started to think a great deal about it. And I created this piece, which is a screen made entirely, again, of leather. After the talk, we can go over and look at that one so you guys can see the level of craftsmanship. And this, for me, was a screen that represented the history of violence in Lithuania. It's, I think I said it's 16 feet by 7 feet. It took about a year to make. Here's a different photo which shows hands on the side so you can begin to see a little bit of the scale. So for me, this is kind of like a gigantic history painting, almost when you go, to the Met or something and you see the Battle of so-and-so or the crossing of the Delaware. It's what an artist does to internalize an historical event, not only to monumentalize it, but to comment upon it in a way that the everyday people don't think about. So in this situation, people say, how could this have happened, not only to me in the modern age, but how could this have happened during the war? I think it's sort of the artist's job, like it would be for a teacher or a clergyman or any other person, to take on the responsibility of trying to decode what happened, trying to understand what happened, to help the rest of the world sleep, yeah? So this was the major piece that started all of this. These are some details where you begin to see a bit of the texture of the skins. So this is all marquetry of leather, kind of like you would see wood marquetry on old furniture, for example. And these details give you an example of some of the very close-up and meticulous technique. And then what I did is I decided to make a suite of etchings because I just wasn't done with this project. Somehow it just kept cooking inside of me. What happened? What happened? And I started doing more research and more research. And so what I did is I went back to the screen and I took details, and then on the etching plates, not photographically, I rendered an idea of what the skins might actually look like, and I did this series of this series of etchings of small details that were on that big screen. And this I did with Mirós printmakers in Spain. This was actually the last big portfolio that they did. So again, these are all details like you might see in the other leather piece. Some were large, some are very small. The prints, of course, are all the same standard size. And then as I continued to look into this, I learned an incredible story about a man named Sugihara. And this led me again into places that I never thought I would go. Sugihara was the Japanese consul during the war in Kovno. And there are three people who did mass savings of people during the war. You all know Schindler, of course, because of Schindler's List. He did it for profit. Probably a lot of you also have heard of Raoul Wallenberg, who saved a lot of Jews in Budapest. He was given the assignment by the Swedish government to do that. Sugihara, nobody knows why he did what he did. But what he did is he allowed up to 6,000 Jews from this town, and this is before the massacres I'm talking about, he allowed them exit visas to transit through Kobe, Japan. Now, I couldn't wrap my head around this because I'm imagining this community, this very locked-in Lithuanian community, suddenly ending up in 1941 Japan, and how do these two cultures see each other? And how do these two cultures interact with each other? And this, we'll get to more images, led to this body of work continuing on to Japan. This is a series of 5 pastels because I didn't let go of my vocabulary of the toys and monsters. In fact, I used them as a way to recreate the narrative of what had happened to me and what I saw happening. What's important for me is that when you all look at the art, you don't see one specific explicit thing. Again, it's not agitprop. You don't look at the art and say, oh, wow, this is about, You see art. It's my job to imbue it with different levels of meaning, and then you can bring what you want to it. For me, this series, which is in the Whitney, tells the story. This is the executioner. These are the perpetrators. This is the victim. And these are pastel on black paper. These are the witnesses. This is the savior. So in these five pastels, which really are absolutely within my vocabulary, I reference back this historical event as it deals with me, as it reflects upon me. This is a triptych It's a little bit hard. Of the decapitation. Of the entrance into Kovno. This is another screen. I won't go into the iconography now. There are two pieces that I will explain what's going on. One is that one, which we can do in person if we have time, and one smaller one, because there's a lot going on in these. But this one is a tribute to the gays among those 40,000 that would have been massacred in Kovno. And this one, gosh, it's about, well, it's not 16 feet. This one is, I don't know, probably, well, I don't know, big, but not monumental. And now to lighten up the story a little bit, and to let you know also that I'm not, this project wasn't a one-note Johnny that ate up 10 years of my life. There are, of course, many other things going on in an artist's life, and I was invited by the Bernardaud Foundation in Limoges to help them figure out how to push the limits of porcelain. Okay, so now put on a new head completely. We're talking about a whole new thing that got crunched down in the middle of this other project that has a lot more levity to it. So it took about 3 years going back and forth with Limoges to figure out how to make something like I wanted to make. I figured that porcelain comes with preconceptions of delicacy and fragility. And I thought, wow, but in fact, porcelain is incredibly strong. I don't know how many of you have, your mother's and grandmother's porcelain, but in fact, it's much harder than pottery. It doesn't chip easily. It also has this kind of intense mythology around it that it gets cooked at much higher levels, at much higher temperatures. So in a way, it goes into this kind of hell, into this inferno, and it comes out as this white, perfect, pure thing. And I was very interested in this, so I went up to the factories, and I spent some time with them to see what they were making. And I said, well, can we work on something that shows both strength and fragility at the same time? So again, it fits within that vocabulary of extremes. Healthy, ill, victim, victimizer, fragility, strength, power, powerlessness, master, slave. These kinds of constant bouncing back between ideas of extremes, because the middle is a little bit boring, I think. Right? So what I developed with them was a sculpture about so high, about the size of a 9-year-old boy, that is a working toy, okay? When you push him, and I'll show images, when you push him, he bounces back and forth. And it took us a long time to figure out how to do this in porcelain, because also remember that they're a porcelain factory, they're not engineers. So here I come, I didn't have a team of people. We would sit around and troubleshoot and make drawings and figure out how do we put it together, how do we weight it, how do we get, because they didn't know how to do anything except for make cups and saucers, So we had to figure this out. And I don't know if you remember the photographs. The first photographs I showed you were of this kind of push-me, pull-me toys. So these are images that I've been working with really since the late 80s. And what I loved also so much about porcelain is you see what's happening in the face. I decided not to articulate the face of these sculptures because the light and the shadow actually creates the different personalities that this sculpture inhabits. And as you push him, the face changes completely. Sometimes you'll see a little mustache, and sometimes a big smile. It just really depends on how the light works on the porcelain. So I thought that I was using both the strength and the fragility, and adding to that the dimension of shifting personalities and shifting psychologies, if you will. For me, this also can harken back to the idea of the role of the artist in society, who absorbs the desires of everybody else because the artist represents freedom, as it were. So some people want the artist to be the maniac or the drunk, and sometimes people want the artist to be the prophet or the seer. Yeah, sometimes people see the artist as the one who doesn't have to work, or the one who's free, or the one who can do anything. And for me, the artist, in this sense, almost becomes a kind of punching bag that's always bouncing back, which, again, is an embodiment of strength and fragility. I did a lot of work 10 years before this body of work that I'm talking to you about, based on my investigations into Dada and surrealism, and Zurich Dada specifically. And the kind of proto-artist writer who, if you will, invented Dada is a French writer named Alfred Jarry. And Alfred Jarry wrote a play called Ubu Roi, or King Ubu. And Ubu, this is kind of a universal symbol of the beginning of modernism, if you will, of the beginning of this sort of art history. And this is one of the few drawings we have from the original edition of Ubu Roi, which I think is 1904. Is that right, Fabrice? I think in 1904, around then. And Jarry himself, as a writer, we know very little about him, but he lived in a garret in Paris, and he was a wild man. I mean, he picked fights on the street. He got beaten up. He was a very violent, tough guy who always stood up again. And so I'm kind of using him as the source for the form of these toys. Now, here you actually see them wobbling. It is possible to go on my website, and there's a video that will show these guys in action, and they're pretty amazing because when you push it, it's 140 pounds, and you're positive, the porcelain's only 1/4 of an inch thick, and you're positive it's going to smash. But it doesn't, because what I learned in this great adventure in Limoges is that porcelain will break if you go like that. So it hates contact. But if it goes like this, it is so strong. 1/4 of an inch will hold easily 30 pounds of lead without cracking. What I did with them, this I put because it's fun and I'm wearing the same springtime April jacket. It's in honor of my father. It's his Sunday jacket. This is for French TV. This is an installation in France. Now, what I did, and you can see a little bit about the shadows that I was talking about. You see how the personality of the sculptures actually change as light and transparency hit them and as movement hits them. So they go from happy to sad to monster to innocent. Then what I did is I began a large body of works on paper that in fact does articulate the faces. So I gave the actual personalities, which you see some of in the background. This is an installation of 7. All in all, there were 14 of these made. So I'm just, again, showing you different ones to show you how the reflection changes the character. Now, these in French, I call this body of work button ass, okay? And partly it's because he sits on his ass. I mean, that's the fulcrum of this kind of a toy, right? You all had them as children. It's boom, boom, and there he is, right there. And I also do it because in French, and this was in Limoges, so I wanted to kind of create a full idea around this project. In French, this toy is called a culbuto. And I thought, what in the world is a culbuto? Where does this come from? What is this etymology? But in a kind of Duchampian morphology, the word cul means ass in French, and buto is just one letter short of button. So I titled him Button Ass because he sits on his button ass. But in addition, I went further and looked up the origin of the word culbuter, which was incredible to me. It's a military verb, and it means you use it when you describe one army overthrowing another army. And so I looked deeper into the etymology, and again, I don't want to shock anybody, but to overthrow, or to be, if you'll excuse me, fucked over, literally means that when you win, you flip him. And one army actually takes possession of the enemy. And I thought, this is insane. How can this even be? And they, of course, created this toy because it really literally means head over heels. That's a nice way of putting it. And here the button itself, in fact, is a reference. These are installation shots from the Mona Bismarck Foundation in Paris, which is right behind the Palais de Tokyo, facing the other side of the river from the Eiffel Tower. And it's a beautiful exhibition space by an American who left it as a museum, as a foundation. And you can't see here, but it's all chinoiserie, wallpaper. It's a beautiful space with a lot of mirrors. So this was only the 7 sculptures, but with the mirrors, it gives you an idea of what this installation can be with the works on paper associated with it. This was in northern France in a museum in a small city called Beauvais. So it shows how these can function in different architectural settings. And here explains a little bit also this idea of Ubu, King Ubu that I was telling you about, and how Ubu Kulbuto almost forms a kind of Duchampian form of language, which is a morphology of how the language forms itself. Now, for extra levity, I don't know if anybody knows who that woman is. She clearly has no right to be wearing Chanel, but she is wearing Chanel. That is Bernadette Chirac, and I added this little chapter in because I know, for those of you who remember, the Chiracs have a specific history here in Texas, since they were not invited to the ranch. This was sort of a command performance that I was asked to do for the Chiracs. Well, it was quite an experience, let me put it that way. This is all art talk aside, but the one next to Bernadette is sort of a sycophant. The one next to him is the director of Dior, Avenue Montaigne, and the one next to me is an ex-mistress of Berlusconi who he actually was passing on to President Chirac. And it I told you it would be a different kind of artist talk, and it was quite something. We had a private luncheon, and watching the interaction between Monsieur le Président and Madame was quite shocking. There's Monsieur le Président. Afterwards, I can tell some people in private what ensued. It was completely untoward, involving the friend of Berlusconi, etc. This again is to go back to some of the imagery and show how early I was using this imagery. This is a lino cut that I made, I think, in 1990, so that would be 25 years ago. To show really that I was already working with this image, which has been recurring throughout my career. Again, from the same period. These were handmade lino cuts that I made in a press in my studio when I was a young artist and didn't have the opportunity to work with established printmakers, but really had the need to make prints. A drawing just to show you that this investigation went on. So for me, the invitation to Limoges was a chance to actually realize in porcelain something that I had been working with for a long time. These are some of the accompanying drawings that you saw in the exhibition with the sculptures. So again, you see I'm doing the opposite here. Here I'm articulating the personalities, the various personalities that I don't show on the sculpture itself. This one's called Boing. Two-Face. This one, well, it shows I've been living in Spain for a long time. There's some Goya influence here. More examples of further investigations that came after the sculpture to enhance the installation of the sculpture and to add layers of intimacy to the sculptures themselves, to make them, in fact, books, if you will, to bring them back to the book of King Ubu, to bring them back to the idea of the word. Now, these are enormous. These are about half the screen, one of these. And these were my final investigation in this sculptural body of work. These are pastels. They take about 4 to 6 months, and I make them with Q-tips. So they're literally dozens of layers of different colored pastel that then gets worked by hand. I sometimes can only do a few centimeters, maybe this much in a morning or sometimes a day, because I'm using Q-tips to blend. So what I'm not doing is anything traditional that you do with pastel. I didn't learn how to do that. I started using pastels because we went to see a pastel exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay, I guess about 6, 7 years ago, and Fabrice said to me, "Why don't you do pastels?" And I said, "Well, I have a box of old Rembrandts that I never touched that have been in the studio since, I don't know, I was a teenager." And I pulled them out, and it just came out just like this. So these are very large, and they are meant, of course, again, to accompany these sculptures. They're quite haunting when you see them in a large format. You can't really see here, but the texture is quite velvety. It almost looks like a deep, rich cloth. And I don't use this technique. I don't know if any of you have tried pastels before, where you layer from what is it? You layer from dark to light or light to dark. I don't even remember how you're supposed to do them to create the highlights. I ignore all of that. So under these greens and reds are also, as I see fit, purples and yellows and all kinds of different things. And here, again, I was trying to see if I could capture in 2 dimensions the kind of spatial clarity. I don't know what to call it, really. The surface element of porcelain, which is like nothing else, because I felt quite privileged to be able to do these in porcelain, to be invited to do them. It would have, cost hundreds of thousands to manufacture this. And I didn't want to let down the factory either, the people I was working with. I wanted them to also know that I fully respected their attention to medium and their love of material. Now to bring you down again and go back to the continuation of the Cove No Kobe. Poor Anna. It's like, no, give me the happy stuff. So I'm not a painter. I've never painted in my life. I work in every other media. I don't know what you would call exactly what I do, but I don't push around that stuff. That's of no interest to me, and I don't work in the studio that way. It's not like I go in and go, let's make 20 sketches and we'll end up with this. There's an idea and it's executed, and sometimes there's only 4 or 5 things a year. So if you go to my studio and you open the flat files, you don't find hundreds of drawings, you find maybe 2, because this is it. So I don't paint, but I saw these small pre-stretched canvases that are only 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters. And I said to myself that I wanted to push pastel a little farther. And I wanted to see what I could do really just using my fingers on canvas, and to see how elemental I could do it. Elemental because the violence is elemental. Violence is elemental. It's dirt. It's the body. There's nothing to catch it. Yeah, there's no net. So I didn't want to use a brush, and I didn't want to use a Q-tip, and I didn't want to use another medium. I wanted to see what would happen if I created a series of victimizers just directly using pastel. And of course, learned, and as we all know, in Degas and things like this, and Toulouse-Lautrec, they consider pastel paints in a sense, because really the only difference between pastel and paint is the pigment is suspended in a medium, yeah? But otherwise, it is, in a sense, painting. So I created these, my first and only paintings, which are a series of victimizers. So I continued to investigate this story. I wasn't finished with it. This is something that I don't know how to explain to an audience or get across. When you're done, you're done. It's the same way when you know the body of work is finished, you can walk away from it. And when you're finished with an idea, it morphs into another idea, often before you even have a chance to realize it. It's only in retrospect that you see you're doing something slightly different or that's been pulled out from the thing before. This just kept coming back. Maybe because of family history, maybe because of deeper investigations into the Holocaust, maybe because of further conversations with peers and other artists. I can't explain it to you, but the story wasn't over for me. I had thought originally that that big screen would finish it, but it just wasn't over. It kept going and going. And then it became, I went back to the black paper and created another series, this time of masks, because I was haunted by this night in 1941. But I started thinking also, what happens during the night? How do shadows work? How do light and shadow work? Who's the bad guy and who's not the bad guy? Who's the boogeyman and who's not the boogeyman? Sort of let them speak for themselves, yeah? And again, I think if you saw this on a wall in an institution or in a gallery or in your home, you don't need to know all the stuff I'm telling you. You can bring to the piece whatever level of investigation you see fit. Further investigated because I started thinking about the children. Okay, so I have the homage to various populations within the massacre. So again, using my normal vocabulary to make it quite simple, what is the thing that you love the most and abuse the most? This is a very simple metaphor. It's the stuffed animal, right? And this is the thing that you drag in the street, that you stomp on, that you pull the head off of, and that you sleep with. And it's a simple idea, but it can be carried over, and has been by many artists, many filmmakers, into the relationship even between the Nazi and the Jew, between the victim and the victimizer, the close relationship. These are small blackboards, as you can see, and again, this is pastel. Turned out I could use pastels. And this is one piece. I showed you the installation shot, but just to give you an idea of the detail of the working, of the texture of the pastel. And I also thought, well, you go to sleep. This is almost like a Disney movie. You go to sleep and, the stuffed animal comes alive and has this other life. But what happens if there's a dark side to that story and it isn't a Tinkerbell story? And then just in terms of formal issues, the idea of chalk on blackboard was an obvious place to go. So that we have kind of a pedagogy, a slate, a toy, a childhood, this sort of thing. I love Piggy. It's Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this piece, and this piece I will explain a little just because the iconography has been extremely all over the place and it's hard to read them. And these things can be read. I had been working on this project for quite a while, and my friend, a Texan artist named Kay Rosen, had worked with a museum in San Francisco, the Contemporary Jewish Museum. And she said, Jonathan, I just did a show with these people, and here's a curator who might be interested in this project. So I said, great, and I contacted the museum, and they said, well, we're not thinking about projects like that now, but we're going to be doing a show about Genesis, and would you make a piece for us? And I said, sure. I mean, I guess every artist should illustrate the Bible, right? Without ever having thought about this or had any desire to do this at all. And what happened is they gave me 2 verses from Genesis. So I was given the burial of Sarah and finding a wife for Isaac, sometimes known as Rebekah at the well. These are not like, this is not Cain and Abel we're talking about here. And so it was a little difficult to figure out, well, what am I going to do? And I found out about this, this commission, if you will, while we were at a barbecue at the neighbor's house, and one neighbor said, oh, we're in Spain, so one neighbor said, oh, I have an illustrated Dali Bible, and they went and got the Dali Bible, and the whole dinner party ended up being a conversation around Genesis. And I thought, well, what's going on with the burial of Sarah? I looked in art historical books and found that only Doré, who had illustrated the Bible in the 19th century, with those shoots of light and the gowns, all this neoclassicism and symbolism, he's the only one who ever did the burial of Sarah. So I had no precedent. So I started reading deeply into the commentary of Genesis, into the religious apocryphal books, into the legends of Genesis, and found out that, in fact, the burial of Sarah is quite interesting. Sarah's buried in a cave. Abraham goes to the Canaanites and he says, I want to bury her in that cave. And the Canaanites say, why that cave? We'll lend it to you. And Abraham says, no, I'm going to pay for it. And many people think that use this as a defense for the existence of Israel today, because we have this passage where Abraham actually exchanges money for a piece of land. And in Genesis, it even tells how many shekels or whatever they're called. And this is very interesting. But in the commentary, the question is, why does he want this cave? What's so special about this cave? Well, what's so special about this cave is it's supposedly where Adam and Eve are buried. And it's the portal to paradise. And when the cave is opened, Eve, who you see as a kind of a green head with her hand over her mouth and a serpent's tail, Eve tries to escape. But she has to be pulled back because, of course, Eve is the evil, naughty, the naughty Eve. Where she's going, the portal to paradise on the upper left there, and we can look at this afterwards, if you tilt your head just a little bit sideways, actually is an apple with a bite out of it. I wondered, why did Sarah die? Because nobody dies at that portion of Genesis. Everybody lives forever. And I thought, well, why does she die? She dies because the devil comes to her, and the devil says, Abraham is about to kill Isaac on the Temple Mount. And she doesn't die because of that. She dies because later she hears that her son is still alive, and she dies of joy. I don't know who here has a mother. Or a Jewish mother, but this is like so apropos, it's unbelievable. So for me, I want to get all the hysteria of this craziness, all the dying. You see Adam and Eve in the two circles. You see Sarah not wanting to listen to the devil. You see the arm going around and grabbing, yanking Eve back. You see the stalactites. You see in the center there's a bit of even sky and flowers looking out of the cave. You see the coins here on the bottom left that were exchanged to buy the cave. You see the tomb to the left, that yellow thing with the body, because people were buried in standing tombs in that situation. So you see all the iconography that's meant to represent a kind of hysteria. And that's what I was trying to portray, and we'll look at it later for those of you who want to, and you can see it in person. Now, the next verse was impossible for me. The next verse is Abraham goes to his servant, and he says to the servant, go find a wife for Isaac. Why? Because they're a little bit sexist, and Sarah's dead, and they need another woman around. Now, finally, it's time to marry off Isaac. So the servant in the passage says, places his hand under the thigh of Abraham and takes an oath. So we're at this dinner party in Spain, all asking each other, what does that mean? Nobody has any idea. An oath, you put your hand on the Bible. You put your hand on the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, we found out that what that means is the servant places his hand on the circumcised penis of the master because the circumcision is the covenant with God. And he takes an oath, right? This is not like, this is just right out there for everybody, and you'll see it in the Bible many times over. Places his hand on the thigh and takes an oath. And I thought, what? This is impossible. Now, this verse is usually represented by Rebecca at the well, which is also kind of a gross story. I mean, that the servant goes out and basically finds a 12-year-old girl, offers her candy, and they marry her off to Isaac. And Poussin is best known for having painted this. Well, I thought that's not where the action is. The action is, in fact, somewhere around taking the oath, if you'll allow me. And the other thing, just before I move on, is remember that nobody aged. So even though these men were, I don't know, 100 years old, 500 years old, they didn't look it. So that's the other side of this piece. And these are quotes that are tooled in gold. So from one side it says, I am a stranger and an alien. Well, we'll read them later. I can't even read them. And the other says, so the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master. And you'll all find that. That's verse 24:9. These are just details, which I don't need to stop because we can see it in person. This is, again, a drawing that I made after the piece itself, where I decided to just continue the investigation of claustrophobia, of the burial in the cave, and specifically work with renderings of different textures. And then I took this even farther. I had two young printmakers who came to live with me in Spain for the summer, and we created a 16-plate woodcut, which wasn't easy, but we created this, which is a further detail pulled out from the original piece, focusing just on Eve, the apple, and the portal to paradise. And back to Kovno-Kobe. Another screen, and I can a little bit read you guys through this one. I think we still have about 10, 15 minutes. Yeah, we keep going. I told you about this Japanese fellow, Sugihara. And Sugihara saved all of these people, and they all ended up in Japan. And he was a fascinating character. He came from a samurai family. He was a diplomat. He spoke Russian and German perfectly. He was a spy, we know now. And he asked his government, could he save these people? And the Japanese government said, out of the question. And he defied the government, and he created, in the beginning, visas by hand, which are works of art in their own right, because they're calligraphy, beautiful Japanese calligraphy, which he was trained in. By the end, he was throwing stamped pieces of paper out of the train that took him away from Lithuania. So all in all, we don't know how many people he saved. We know that there are at least 60,000 descendants of Sugihara Jews. More than 2,000 ended up in Kobe with proper visas, but we know that more than 10,000 pieces of paper were generated. And for me, the idea of these papers as works of art is also a whole nother investigation. This is a smallish screen, but again, all in leather. You see up there, and this one I'll try to read you through a little bit. You see the train, and the train kind of turns into a serpenty monster. You see the wheels of the train, those two circles, but those wheels of the train are also the eyeglasses. You see a kind of nose coming down in yellow. Are you guys following this? You see nose sort of coming down. Then you see an arm in purple coming, and the arm is playing keys. It's playing keys of the accordion. But it could also be the mustache of the nose, for example. Many things in my work can be read from right to left and left to right because I see things in palindromes. It's the way it works for me. So I think the art historical term for it is creative metamorphosis. And it's the way I see it. I read things in two ways, and often they represent two things. Boy, this is a little hard. So you'll see, for example, a goose's head and a goose's neck and a golden egg. Or you'll see an eye and an eye wearing a hat. You'll see ears, and coming from the ears are payas, or the curly hair that you see in Orthodox. You'll see that snake coming from the train sort of turns into a monster with horns. But you'll see it also has a kind of a magenta-colored torso and a leg coming down here that spikes open ahead, and a leg coming in this direction that spikes at the neck of this goose. And the leg here will have a shoe that's also a club. And you see, and there's much more going on, but we'll stop with that. And you see here, in a way, Sugihara doing battle with the demon. So you see his sort of Japanese samurai head style with chopsticks, but also the horns of the serpent become emanations from the warrior with Mount Fuji in the background. You'll see the accordion. So again, this is all continues to reference the vocabulary of this story and my investigation of how to internalize my own rejection from the museum. You know, and like I said, if you had asked me 15 years ago if I would be making work like this, I would say, what are you talking about? Visually, I would be making exactly the same work. But around this topic, the topic came to me, and there is no more interesting topic. I was telling Jed last night, the curator here, that I was in Zurich with David Weiss from Fischli Weiss, and we were up late at night, and we were in a bar, and we ended up talking about this stuff. And he said, but all we ever are doing is making art about the Holocaust. That's all we're really thinking about at all, Peter and I. And that's not what you think of necessarily when you see Fischli Weiss work, but he said that's all that there, I mean, that's the topic that never goes away with no answer. And I think that, again, you could see that screen and not get any of that. And that's fine. This is just an installation of a small museum in the Bronx where I was able to show some of this work. Does it give you an idea of installation? Yeah, it's a strange architecture, but it's a beautiful, actually a beautiful Italian glass. Then I went to Japan, and this is very recent. Actually, Jeremy, you saw this one in Barcelona before I took it to Japan. I went to Japan to find out what is this really about, and I'm sort of winding up here, so if you'll be patient a little longer. The screen, there's a Japanese, you all know Japanese screens, of course. Usually they're about temporal things, like experiencing the flower, experiencing the walk through the woods. They're not narrative and they're not figurative in a Western sort of way. But in the 16th century, there was a type of screen called the Namban screen. And this kind of screen was developed to represent the arrival of the Portuguese into Japan, because the Japanese had no understanding whatsoever of who these people were. So they created this narrative type of screen. They're in the British Museum, they're in the Kobe Museum, they're in the Lisbon Museum, they're in the Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon. They're highly prized genre of art. The Suntory Museum in Tokyo. And they show the Portuguese with gigantic noses and ridiculous clothes, and they show Japanese people looking behind curtains going, ah. And it's really a fascinating genre. And my screens, I believe, are in direct relation to Namban screens and sculptures. They are about what happens when you are confronted suddenly with the other, but you can't understand what you're seeing or who the other is. And in this sense, it's for me, quite political art. What did the Japanese see when these very poor, war-torn Jews came from Lithuania to Kobe? And what did the Jews see when they ended up in Japan? Because there's zero common reference point. And this goes back to a kind of French theory, a kind of semiotic theory that the big example maybe is Svetan Todorov's The Conquest of America. How did Cortez with 200 men overcome Montezuma and the Aztecs? Because the way they saw each other had no direct relationship that either side could understand. Montezuma was living in a world of prophecy. He was living in a world of calendar. He was living in a world where things that happen come true. For the Aztecs, a man on a horse was a living being that was then detached. It was a centaur that could come apart in two. There was zero understanding of vocabulary of what each side saw in the other, and that explains it. They didn't know what a gun was because a gun didn't represent just that you could shoot something and kill someone. Different ways of seeing each other. So for me, when I went to Japan for 2 months this last spring, and this is the last quick body of work I'll show you, I was investigating what each saw in the other. For the Japanese, the octopus is a national symbol. It's the symbol of celebration, festival, family. It's the symbol of sex, because it's an erotic symbol. You will even see in Japan playgrounds with children's slides made in form of plastic octopus. Now, for a Jew from Lithuania, absolutely not possible to exist. There are no octopi in the Baltic Sea. It's absolutely against dietary laws. It's a monster. So here's an example of how, for one people, what you have at Thanksgiving, for another people is a monster from outer space. So I started thinking about the octopus, and also this kind of, you've seen Hasid Orthodox Jews who have these payas, these side locks. And I started thinking, when the Japanese sees the payas, he sees the octopus with a big nose. Again, relating to this Portuguese chapter of art history. And vice versa, the Jew sees the octopus as a monster. So this is a piece that kind of overlays that. So you see the octopus in this sense is wearing an Orthodox octopus. He's wearing a skull cap. The rising sun also has embedded in it a Star of David. This is a map of Kobe down here on the left. Again, this is all in leather with palladium and gold. The frame is a period frame because there was a fascination with European Art Deco and Art Nouveau during the Meiji period. And then I began working with silver point, and I'm almost done here, everybody. The silver point, for me, is because silver point is when you actually draw with a piece of silver. And if you take a silver and you rub it on paper, nothing happens. But if you treat the paper in a certain way, it will make a mark that's indelible. It was used in the Renaissance to make architectural drawings, because when you make a long line with a pencil, it doesn't keep its sharpness, but a piece of metal will. So very, very articulated Renaissance architectural drawings will be done in silver point. No one's really using it now. For me, I like it for several reasons. For one thing is that we're dealing with issues of memory here, and we're even dealing with issues where there is no memory. Again, going back to my canceled show in Lithuania, why did they cancel the show? I don't really know, because there's nothing on the ground in Lithuania that has anything to do with me. There's no grave, there's no family, there's no nothing. It's all absent. So it's a memory of nothing. It's an absent memory. So I'm fascinated with this idea. The Jews that went to Kobe, there is no mark left. I've been to Kobe. The curators at the museum there are very kind to me. There's not, we don't even know anything. Kobe's been destroyed by earthquake, by fire. This was so long ago. They go, well, we think one building might have been here. It's that absent, yeah? And yet, it's very resonant for the people in Kobe because they're proud of themselves for having done the right thing, if I can call it that. So I'm very interested in this silver point because silver makes a mark that's indelible. You can't erase it once you make the mark. In addition, it's invisible unless you treat the paper. And lastly, it tarnishes like memory. So through the years, it turns purple, just like, you know, your grandmother's silver if you don't polish it, because memory, in fact, deepens in color and changes in color. So these are just various silver points that I made. And then I'll end with these. These are not good photographs, I apologize, but I'll end with these two pieces, this and another one. These I did this year. These are enormous. This is more than 2 meters, this is more than 6 feet by, I don't know, 5 feet. So let's again say this is about half of this screen. These are done on handmade Japanese paper, again, to take this sort of European, to speak in formal terms, to take a European Renaissance technique and marry it to a Japanese technique as I see those two cultures conflicting and interacting with each other. And it also references a kind of late 19th century period of Japanese art where modern inventions of optics came into Japanese art. So in other words, in the late 19th century, they saw their first telescopes, their first microscopes, their first maps as we use them in the West. And they began to incorporate the idea of perspective and scientific instruments into their methodology of art making. So I'm bringing all of this together, and what I have is, and this is silver point. This is all drawn with a little needle. This takes months. It's insane. On the right is the octopus, but if you see, he has a big nose and an eye over there, and he's wearing a religious hat, because that's what the Japanese saw. In the center is a Japanese wearing a formal farmer's bonnet, and she is a spring onion because her hair is straight, and what the Jew saw was nothing but a straight-haired onion, because that's all they could understand in the semiotics of the situation. If you notice the top of the onions in the middle, she's covering her eyes because she doesn't want to see what she sees. On the left, we have the chrysanthemum flower, which is the imperial flower, which is also a representation of big noses. Much as in Namban art, the Portuguese were depicted with big noses, and a religious beard and a religious hat, but the religious beard is dried squid, because that Japanese almost never have facial hair and no curly hair. So how did they even recognize curly hair? Curly, in Japanese linguistic semiotics, would be a tentacle. Below that transitions into a map of Kobe. And on the right, bottom right, is one square kind of outlined in red, and that would be the neighborhood in Kobe where these people arrived. So kind of weaving a sort of Murakami type of story. I'm bringing the West and the East together to try to understand how people look at each other and how people recognize each other and how people misinterpret each other in this story in a benevolent way, in other stories in an incredibly violent way. But this talk today with this and the last one I'll show you end on a benevolent note because the Japanese saved a lot of people. And this is a diptych of two very large pieces. So when you put these together, let's say they're about, well, they're about the size of the screen. And this is the bookend to that piece. This is Sugihara in the center as a flayed, stripped Baltic tuna, witnessing with his blue eye. Again, I apologize for the photograph, but I haven't had a chance to get these done properly. Wearing a samurai helmet. On the right, we see Baltic seaweed, because of course for the Japanese, seaweed is an edible food that's on the table at every meal. Wearing a secular hat. Again, this is all in silver point, drawn with a small needle. That then transitions into a vein that's skinned, that's flayed, because of the violence of what one witnesses. On the left, and unfortunately you can't see any of the detail, is a bowl of very tiny eels in kind of a oxygenated froth, which is also a skull cap. If you see, there's a bobby pin holding the hat on. There's a black line on the upper left there, sort of, and an eel that follows down. So we have the curly hair and the fish and the different characters of the religious Jew, Sugihara, and the secular. Then, continuing this idea of late Edo period mapping, we see the map of the Kovno, of the city of Kovno, integrated. This was the ghetto, and this is the ghetto of Kovno. Yeah, and so that's like kind of a giant diptych that I've just finished. And I think that will bring us to an end. Thank you very much. So if anyone has any questions, you can ask them now, or I guess since there's a reception, we can do it informally, however you want, Anna. Get some wine, it's because it's hot in here, yeah? And we do it that way, but anyone please ask me anything they want, okay? And if you want to look more closely at this, we can bring the lights up, and we can take a look at that, and I'll give you an idea of what's happening. Thank you.